Good afternoon, fellow ruminators. Thank you for joining another session. I'm indeed happy to be with you one more time to discuss a very important topic. Now, I want to thank those of you who have viewed the video that I had entitled The Myth of Jamaican Independence. That's part one. I noticed that part two has not been well watched or well viewed, or widely viewed, I should say, as part one was. Now, it's not being viewed a lot on YouTube because I think since the production of my first video on Are the Jews God's Chosen People, my views on YouTube have been, trending down, to say the least. Now, I think that we are living in some very dark times, and I have been hearing lots of other YouTube influencers or presenters, whatever you want to call them. They have been also complaining that YouTube has been also censoring their speech. Now, when our speech is censored, it means therefore that we are not going to be able, in most cases, to come to an understanding of the truth. And already, for the last few years, we have been seeing where the government, in alignment with the private industries and firms and organizations, have been trying to censor our speech and to silence truth, right? And that is important for us to understand. But we've got to continue to fight. And one of the things that we have to understand also, those of us who are not speaking the truth and speaking it to power because we're afraid one day we are going to be asked to do the same, right? We will be confronted and we will have to give our individual answers. So it is also good right now to practice, right? To practice to have that courage and to be able to say what you think is truthful, not to be following the bandwagon and to follow what your friends are saying and what the majority says. Because one of the things you need to understand that the majority is never right, right? When people, when you have 87% of the people going in one direction, you've got to question why are they going. I'm not saying now that all the time they're wrong, but you've always got to question because most of the times they are not going in the right direction, right? So you have to bear that in mind. Now, today we are going to look at Jamaica again, right? And I'm titling this video, Jamaica, a failed experiment, right? So a failed independence experiment. Jamaica and the Cold War, I should say, a failed independence experiment, right? Because I think that we have lost our way. I don't think that at this juncture we are going to regain our steps because those years have long passed. In fact, the entire Western societies are in flux and are rapidly losing their independence. And, I tend to hear people from Jamaica, right, those who are living in Jamaica and some of the people in the diaspora, who keep on saying that they're using the United States as a measuring stick, all right, to suggest that, the United States took years to be a prosperous nation. Now, one of the things you need to understand is that from day one of its independence, of the United States independence, it had a constitution that was perhaps the best the world has ever seen, and in which it articulated clearly that it wanted self-governance, right? It wanted autonomy. It wanted to run the show on its own accord, right? Now, Jamaica, as we learned in the myth of Jamaican independence, part one, from the speech given by Norman Gervin, we have never had a constitution that was aligned or still is aligned with the realities of the country, right? It was a recycled constitution that was there even during colonialism before independence. So it was a farce, right? It was farcical. It wasn't something that was true. Our independence is not true, right? Because the Constitution should be the guide, should be the standard And that is how slavery was abolished in the United States. It was dismantled because of the Constitution. Without the US Constitution, I would argue that slavery perhaps would not have ended, right? That was the only thing that they were able to use as the guide, right? As the measuring stick. The same thing happened during the civil rights movement during the 1960s, right? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. kept on referring to the standard of the US Constitution. In Jamaica, we have our Constitution is just something that was made up by the British. It was not written or authored by Jamaicans, right? So we need to understand that and learn to know that if we are going to be an autonomous nation, an independent nation, that we've got to write our own constitution. And we have to give Joseph L. Patterson, the leader, the founder of the UIC party, at least he has written a constitution. He, among his followers, his executives, his administration, right? They have written a constitution for what they believe they're fighting for, an independent Jamaica. Now, we're going to get into the weeds of the discussion, and I'm going to share my screen here with you so we don't stay here too long. But this is the author of this is Lieutenant Colonel Ricardo Tyndale, and he got his master's, master's studies. I think he got a master's degree in defense studies from the United States Marine Corps. And so he's Matthew. This is approved by Matthew Slater here, and he got it on April 4, 2017. So this is a recent dissertation, whatever you want to call it, thesis. The title of the thesis was The Jamaica-US Relations, Impact of the Cold War on Jamaica 1960 to 1984. Now, we tend sometimes to speak of independence as if, there was no Cold War going on. And, one of the things that Tyndale argued in this thesis is that most Jamaicans tend to be aware of what happened during the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and perhaps onward, right? But they are not able to contextualize these events, right, in light of the Cold War, right, that was pursuing at that time. I would argue that the Cold War has not finished, right? It has taken on a new sort of dimension. Now, what you need to understand is that the first Cold War, which is Cold War Part 1, I would say, or I would describe it, was when the United States was fighting against global communism, right? So she saw global communism as a threat to her sovereignty and to her power in the world, right? Because the United States, after World War II, emerged as one of the superpowers of the world, along with the Soviet Union. And both contested until we know that the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1989, formally in 1991, that is no more, right? It is no longer a superpower as it used to be before its dissolution. Now, the United States remains the sole superpower of the world. And now we know, particularly after 9/11, that is September 11, 2001, that the United States, has described terrorism, global terrorism. It has pronounced, right, a war. It has waged, I should say, a war on global terrorism. So that's the new enemy. And the sad thing is that we don't know what this global terrorism is all about because, you can be a terrorist depending on what the United States authorities, define as a terrorist. For example, we're seeing what is happening in Israel, and the people who talk against the Jews or who might not agree with what is happening in Israel, they might be deemed a terrorist, right? Or persons who, are supporting hate speech. And if you're supporting hate speech, might as well they call you a terrorist because they're suggesting that you hate. And sometimes because you disagree with something does not mean that you hate the person or the thing, right? And some people also use that word very likely hate, but they don't necessarily mean that they are going to kill you or be of any serious harm to you. They might not like an aspect, an attribute of your character, something that you're doing. And people have been expressing their, discontent with what is happening in Israel, and that is being censored, right? We saw what happened to the three presidents, particularly one at the University of Pennsylvania. What happened to her? She had to, resign her job because of statements that she had mentioned. Now, so we are still in this Cold War, right? On that, it's a new phase of the Cold War. It is not the Cold War on global terrorism, but this is on global communism rather, but it's the Cold War on or against global terrorism. Be that what it may. We don't know what this global terrorism. We can't define it really, because right now anybody can be deemed a terrorist depending on what is happening at the time. Now, this is the period 1960 to 1984 is a significant in Jamaica's history, as it represents an era of transformation of the nation. Having gained independence from colonial rule in 1962, the young nation state sought to establish itself as a democracy and to engage in the international system. In the 1960s, Jamaica's foreign policies reflected a pro-United States outlook. So that needs to be clear, that Jamaica understood that now Great Britain had fallen, right? And it needed to adjoin, it needed to merge, right? Its foreign policy to that of the United States. In the 1970s, however, Michael Manley's government adopted a democratic socialist agenda with policies that resulted in strained relations with the US. The Manley government also established diplomatic relations with communist Cuba, which was not only aligned to the Soviet Union, but also an adversary of the United States in the midst of the Cold War. So he went on to say that this, of course, would affect negatively our relations with the United States. The fact that Jamaica decided now that it would align itself. Not that Jamaica wanted to be, was supporting Cuba in terms of its communist manifesto and its communist, attribute. But the fact of the matter is that we thought that we had to do whatever was in our best interest. But one of the shortfalls of this paper here, this thesis, is that this author is suggesting or has also asserted that a lot of times when we speak about Jamaica's independence, we tend to speak of it in alienation of what is happening on the global scale in the international community, especially among, big players, right? So we know that the United States is one of the big players, and England was, and some of the big powers, the Soviet Union at the time. Now, I could also say that one of the things that he did not present in this essay, in this dissertation, rather, in this thesis, is the fact that we tend to also not view our history from the fact that we are near to what the only empire in this region, which is the United States. We are near to the superpower, the one who is Jamaica, right? So here he says Jamaica's foreign policy evolution through its early years of independence was impacted by the broader dynamics of the Cold War politics, right? So everything that was happening in the Cold War would have impacted on our society. Michael Manley's policies of democratic socialism and of his practice of principled foreign policy in the 1970s were rejected by the US, right? So that is what we need to understand, right? So even though Michael Manley wanted to pursue a domestic and international or foreign policy that would have been in the interest of Jamaicans, particularly those who were coming from the lower stratum of the economic scale, right? The socioeconomic scale, that is. The United States did not want that to happen, right? So he had to change path. We don't have to revisit that history. It was turbulent. I'll talk about it in another video. Now, we know that after World War II, there was a struggle for independence, right? So for international independence, that is, because after World War II, we know that the British Empire, which was a massive empire and controlled, Africa, the Pacific region to the Caribbean region. Now, there was a quest by most of these countries for self-determination, right? To be free, to be independent, right? So that was the scale to which they were going now. They were seeking their independence to run their shows and to be able to make their own decisions. So Jamaica was one of them, right? And he mentioned here in his thesis that the British Empire, that is, did not want to let go of these colonies, these smaller colonies, because that's empires don't like to be, you know, they do not like to give up, their bases, or either the military bases or the colonies. And in this case, Britain did not want to give up her colonies. What she wanted was us to have a federation, right? And we talked about the federation of the West Indian Islands. However, that did not work, and Jamaica decided to go independent. And as a result of that, that federation was broken up in 1961. Now, he gave a very good history of the fact that, we were once a country of the Taínos. Jamaica was what before 1494. We were a country, which was inhabited by mainly Taínos and the Arawak Indians. And the fact that afterwards the Spanish came in 1494, with the Spanish explorer Christopher Columbus, and then the English came on the island, took over the island in 1655. And afterwards, of course, we had slavery ensued until 1834, when slavery was abolished. Now, one of the very important points he raised in his thesis is the fact that after slavery had been abolished, it did not mean that British, the British exploitation was over, right? Is that we need to understand that we were not necessarily free as if we were free in terms of we were unshackled, right? We didn't have the shackles on our hands and feet anymore. But the fact of the matter is that there are other shackles that we needed to have been freed of, but that did not happen. Now, one of the things that he also mentioned that is very, very pertinent to our discussion is the fact that we also need to understand that if we don't have economic independence, right, then we won't be able to have, political independence. We won't be able to have social independence, right? And we won't be able to have any sort of self-determination or autonomy as we think we want to have. And that is very, very important for us to understand. Let's look at this. He says, with the birth of the new nation came many challenges. So we, became independent, as you know, in 1962. Now, let's even backtrack. He was saying after 1834 that because the Freedom Project had not yet been fully accomplished, that is why it led to the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865, right? And afterwards, during the late 1900s into the mid 20th century, you had a proliferation of Black nationalist movement that came upon the island, including the Marcus Garvey movement, that is the United Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. And those movements were geared towards, inculcating a sense of Black pride, among the Black masses, right? Because many of the Black masses were still living, in slave-like conditions. And those movements were geared towards inculcating a sense of Black pride, of racial pride, right? And perhaps Black nationalism, that we were from Africa and we should be proud. Of course, the elites would like to think that, anything that was African was inferior, and that we are, of course, descendants of slaves, and that made us inferior. So it was important that these movements at the time came up, which they did, right? Now, that movement, of course, was not successful in Jamaica, was successful in other countries. The UNIA, that is, was successful more in in America and other parts of the world, in Central America, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you know, in the 1930s, of course, because, you know, we were still going through the fact that we had not achieved, you know, um, freedom. So you had, or work was exploited, you know, so you had the trade union movements that came up, and that movement was headed by Alexander Bustamante, and we know that history. And, you know, so Jamaicans kept on fighting for their freedom, you know, right, you know, throughout that period from 1834 beyond the Monday Rebellion and stuff like that, you know, during the Marcus Garvey movement, right up to that 1930s when we had the emergence of the trade union. Now, also in 1944, we finally received or got the right to vote, that is universal adult suffrage, right? And that was achieved in 1944. And that's why, and that is a right to vote, regardless of your race or gender or color or class or social class. You had that right to vote, right? And we know that, you know, the political parties also were formed around about the 1930s. And we had these two cousins, um, Norman Manley and Alexander Bustamante, who formed those parties. Now, these parties, of course, represented still the colonial interests, because as we have said in the previous videos that, you know, Bustamante was, for the most part, and he said it, that he was pro the United States, and that he was, you know, we were pro-Christian, and that we were anti-communist. Now, I don't think I blame him for saying that. You know, there's nothing wrong in saying that we were pro-Western, because as I think, and it's the fact that we are a Western nation. We are, you know, we're situated in that hemisphere, so we have to function in that hemisphere. The problem is when we have to do the bidding of the metropolis, whether it's in Great Britain or in Washington, right, in the United States. So these are the things that we need to be aware of. In 1962, we became an independent nation, right, according to what they have told us. But we learned here that, you know, we understand that what was happening in the 1940s with the fact that after World War II, many nations in the world were fighting to be decolonized, and were just one of the many nations. Secondly, Great Britain had lost its empire by that time. There was no way, even though it still wanted to keep us as a part of that Commonwealth and the empire, it could not finance us. It could not continue to have these colonies. Um, it could not do it, right? Because the empire, it had lost its empire, the power that it had, the economic wealth that it had was no longer, and the United States had emerged now as the major power in this side of the hemisphere. But we had a problem because not only the United States was building its power, we also had the Soviet Union, right, in the East, which also was trying to, right, to compete with the United States to see who would control, whose ideology would control the world, govern the world, whether it's communism, global communism, or global capitalism, you know, and we know that global capitalism won when they had the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Now, listen to what he's saying here when he's talking about the US-Caribbean relations. The United States has always maintained interest in its close neighbors in the Caribbean. The relationship between the United States and Jamaica has, of course, been framed by the US policy toward the Caribbean. From a national security point, the US projects its interest out in the Caribbean, toward the Caribbean. From a national security standpoint, the US projects its interest out to the Caribbean to extend its borders of defense. The Caribbean basin hosts vital shipping lanes for the US, including a gateway to the Panama Canal. The Caribbean can also be regarded as one of the bridge between South and North America through which trafficking occurs. US interest, moreover, stems not only from national security and economic standpoints, but also from geopolitical sphere, right? So the United States is about, maintaining its interests, right? Its geopolitical interests, right? Its military interests, right? All of these are strategies because remember now that the Caribbean basin is next to the United States. So we can say assuredly that the Caribbean Sea really belongs to the United States, right? Because let us say during the Cold War when, the USSR decided to have military facilities in Cuba, right? That was a threat. The United States thought as a threat. So what if you had lots of other Caribbean countries which were aligned at the time with the USSR? What do you think the United States would be very, very, apprehensive about what could happen in terms of the danger to ensure the security problems that could have arisen out of that sort of arrangement. So in the 1960s, the US witnessed a shift from colonial rule to the formation of several independent island states within the English-speaking Caribbean. So we know that a lot of the English-speaking Caribbean, including Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados and other countries in English-speaking Caribbean nations, they decided to go independent. So the United States was watching, right? She watched and she wanted to see what power were we going to align ourselves with, whether the USSR or with the United States of America itself. Now, this is an important point that, that Halliday raised here. It says that Washington refused to recognize independent Haiti. It was until even in 1861, they didn't want to recognize independent Haiti because if Haiti was independent, well, she was independent, but why the United States failed to recognize Haiti was because she thought that, if the United States should recognize free Haiti or independent Haiti, then other Caribbean countries will also follow in Haiti's footsteps, right? So other Caribbean countries had to be controlled. And the United States would say, well, if you do not, align your interests with that of the United States, then we won't recognize you also. And the trade and other commerce activities that you do with us, we will no longer continue to do so, right? Now, he made a point that the fact that America did not recognize Haiti, that is also why the United States, had many interventions rather, and occupations of the Caribbean and Central American states of Cuba, of Puerto Rico, of Nicaragua, Honduras, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, as well as the acquisition of the Panama Canal. So the United States understand that she had to capture those territories and make sure that everything that is done there is done in her interests, okay, to meet her geopolitical goals and interests as an emerging as a world power. I wouldn't say emerging because she was then, right, a world power at that time. It can be argued that the US was simply securing its strategic interest in the region, right? So we see here where the United States is the de facto colonial power in this hemisphere. And we don't have to recite the Monroe Doctrine, right? Because the United States would not allow any other nation to come here. One of the reasons why Haiti, for example, was occupied in 1915 by the United States was the fact that the United States also thought the Germans, using their U-boat, would have come back to the Caribbean and would have taken over Haiti, right? And would have posed a major threat to its shores. So the United States also, that was one of the reasons. There are many reasons for which they invaded Haiti, which we shall not describe here. Now, look at what he says here, as I mentioned before. The Soviet Union later established a military facility in Cuba and had missiles installed. The US-Soviet confrontation over Cuba came to a head-on in October 1962 during the Cuban missile crisis. This crisis almost resulted in a nuclear war. All right. Now listen to what he says here. Cuba was not the only regional concern for the US. Holidays noted that in 1965, when a nationalist regime came to power in the Dominican Republic, so this is now the DR, the U.S. Marines intervened to oust the government and installed the conservative regime of Joaquin Balaguer that was to rule till 1978. And that is true because I don't know if you know don't know very well the history, but after Trujillo, right, was murdered, after he was assassinated, that the United States, wanted Joaquin Balaguer, which was a puppet of Trujillo. But the citizens, they actually chose Juan Bosch. And Juan Bosch was like a Michael Mann, all right? He was very, very charismatic, a scholar, and someone who believed that the country should be for the citizens and not for, foreign businesses and corporations to do whatever they want with that country. But the economic interests, whatever economic policies were pursued, should be done in the interests of the citizens. But the United States would not allow that. And I think he made a mistake here in his thesis. He was thinking that Warren Bush was, he governed until 1965, but he did not. He was just in presidency for, I think, 8 months, right? His presidency was very short-lived. That's one Bush presidency because the United States decided that they would take him out, they would depose him, which he was deposed. And afterwards, Joaquin Balaguer came and he ruled from 1965 to 1978. He ruled afterwards, but that was during that sort of major upheaval. It's interesting in 1965, when the U.S. Marines came to the Dominican Republic, they came because the citizens realized that the United States was really running the show in their country and that they had no, autonomy. They had no independence, and the United States was a major threat to their independence. And so they decided that they would take up arms, right, and that they would elect or bring back Juan Bush to the presidency. But that did not happen because the United States decided to intervene, and Joaquin Balaguer was chosen by the United States to govern the country. So the United States saw a threat to any country, whether in the Caribbean or in Latin America, who stood up to the United States and wanted to run the country in the interest of the citizens, right? The United States thought that she was not going to have that. Now, this is something interesting that you want to understand. He says here, having lost Cuba to communism, the U.S. would not stand by and allow any other Caribbean nation to align itself with the Soviet Union, right? So we see where the battle was, played, and we have to understand that these are happening not because we are independent, but because, the United States has other ulterior motives, and we have to align our policies, be they social policies or economic policies, with that of the United States. And in most cases, these policies would not be ones that would develop our nation, right? And ensure that we would be lifted, most of our citizens would be lifted out of poverty. Now, in fact, the Monroe Doctrine here, and he is reciting the Monroe Doctrine because sometimes we need to reflect on that doctrine. The 19th century principle that the U.S. would not tolerate foreign intervention in the Western Hemisphere became the central policy governing U.S. Caribbean relations. So even now, that is still the policy that the United States controls this side of the hemisphere. And we've got to understand that, right? So whether it's economic or it's the political realm, the social realm, right? The United States controls, right, this side of the hemisphere. So when we're thinking that Jamaica is going for, freedom and the ability to govern Jamaica, they're going to receive that full freedom, if you will, from Great Britain. That's nonsense because you and I understand that the show is run in Washington, D.C. The British monarchy. Jamaica was a past British colony. Let's put it, not only Jamaica, but other Caribbean nations. And not only the Anglo-Caribbean nations, but you saw here in Haiti and also in the Dominican Republic, and these were not British colonies. These were, French and Spanish colonies. And even in those colonies, the United States runs the show, right? In fact, I was talking to a Dominican the other day, and she was going to vote, telling me that she's going to vote for, the opposition party, that their elections is next year. And she was commenting that the country is bought and sold. That's the deal. She said her country is bought out and it is sold to foreign interests, right? So even they understand that, the country is not governed by the local politicians. They know that they govern, but they know that the show, at the higher, level, because if it's bought and sold out, it means therefore that it is bought and sold out to foreign entities. And this was not a girl that is intellectual, right? Just by observing and reading her politics and see what is happening in the world. And there are many intellectuals, or so they call themselves, who fail to understand this, that, that we do not run the show in Jamaica as we think we do. I think the Latin Americans have had some terrible relations with the United States. One of the things that we can be happy that for some, for the most part, we were aligned with the British Empire, because the British Empire was such a powerful empire. For the most part, we sort of were sheltered, that's Jamaicans, that is. We were sheltered from outside attacks and, interventions and occupations, as Dominicans and the Haitians were subjected to, right? So, but we had one in 2010, so that might have been the end of our history, right? That was not something that was normal to us when the Dudas incursion happened, took place. But that's it happened so frequently or it has happened so frequently in the DR as well as in Haiti. So that was one of the things that we must give the British some credit for, that to some extent we were shielded from all of those occupations and interventions, because of course at that time the British would not have tolerated it. One of the things that we need to understand also, and I think I need to highlight, is the fact that the British Empire started to deteriorate, it started to weaken during the Haitian Revolution. James, that is Sailor James, mentioned that in his book, The Black Jacobins, that because, Britain was fighting for that island too. They wanted, after the French, was defeated by the Haitians, the British wanted that island and fought, right? They fought very hard for that island, and it weakened, right, the British Empire. Much research needs to be done on that to show how much weakened they were after that revolution happened. We know that French Empire died after that revolution, that Haitian Revolution. So, yeah, but it weakened significantly, he said, the British Empire. Need to understand that. Now, let us look at the Jamaican-US relations in 1962 to 1972. The JLP, which won the elections in April 1962, which is the time of our independence. That's just before, right? How many months? That's probably 3 months before elections, before our independence, rather, under the leadership of Alexander Bustamante, led the government of the new independent state in August 1962. According to Diana Thornburn and Diana Marie Morris, with the cutting of colonial ties and the realization of independence came the responsibility of managing one's own international affairs. So now we had to deal with the United States, on our own, right? Before we were shielded by the British, but now we were on our own, and any major conflict, we would have to deal with it without any British assistance. At its infancy as an independent nation, Jamaica foreign policy was oriented towards strengthening relations with North America, right? And David W. Dent noted that Alexander Bustamante described Jamaica as pro-Western, anti-communist, and Christian, ready to align itself with the United States in the Cold War. So these guys were men of their times. Sometimes we tend to criticize them, And I'm not saying that they did not have, they had many flaws. And evidently they were not really looking out for the best interest of all Jamaicans. But at the same time, he mentioned in his thesis that, when we became independent, Jamaica inherited a very weak economy, right? Our economy was not strong, and the British left nothing, right? They exploited us and they left us barehanded, right? With nothing to really run the country, right? So they left their, very empty and, of course, with very limited resources. So it was in the government's best interest to align itself with powerful nations as the United States, because at the time, the United States was so powerful that as a tiny nation, it could, of course, affect our development. And they would have seen during the 1950s and the 1960s also a lot of destabilization efforts in Latin America and also in Asia, in which the United States was, deposing lots of presidents and prime ministers. So they would have to learn, they would have learned, I should say, their lessons from them. Then also noted that Bustamante had inherited an economy that was structurally weak and dependent on the United States, Europe, and the international financial institutions, right? So we are dependent still on these institutions, whether the US, Europe, and also their financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, right? All of these institutions, nothing really has changed that much. Nothing has changed, if you should ask me. Now, in the 1960s, we tried to diversify the economy under the JLP government, right? And this is a time now where we thought that, Jamaica was growing at this very rapid pace. But, he highlighted in his dissertation, in his thesis, not dissertation, but thesis, that Jamaica was controlled by these international corporations, these foreign multinational corporations, right? Whether they were in mining or industries or tourism, right? And many of them, even, he says up to 20 years, they would not have to pay any tax, right? They were on tax break. So, and also their profits would be repatriated to the country of origin or wherever they seek to send their monies to. But that would not be good for national development, right? If you have these major corporations and they're not paying any taxes, so they're not investing really in your country in terms of developing the infrastructure of your country because there are no taxes that they're paying to you. And then their profits are repatriated. So when we hear about these growth and they're saying the economy was growing at 7% of GDP or whatever it was growing at in this great economic time we're having, we must understand that similar to what is happening now, that many of these major corporations, so these large corporations, they repatriated their profits and they were also not paying taxes. So how could we, and they were also exploiting labor. Right? We have to understand that they exploited labor and many of the citizens there would not have any rights in terms of, getting a fair income, fair salary. Now, with the diversification of industries and foreign investments came industrial relation issues. The discontent between the predominantly Black auxiliary labor force and the white foreign managers and supervisors in the newly established industries was compounded by the nation's colonial history. So we see where now that these newly, industrial entities coming from North America, particularly from the United States and from Canada, and whose managers were whites, and they would have that sort of, because remember that even at that time, the United States was a segregated country where Blacks could not use, white facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So they would have some of those sort of, orientation, right? And they would bring those sort of cultural dynamics to the island. And there was a lot of tension between these two groups, right? So they have the 1960s also witnessed the rise of the Black Power movement in Jamaica, given the level of discontent among the Black population. So the Black population, looking at what was happening in the United States, right, with the civil rights movement, they realized they became a little bit more conscious, that, most of our people came from Africa and that most of us also were being exploited by these, these these European masters, colonial masters, or former colonial masters, as I would say. High levels of unemployment existed amongst the Black majority, and opportunities were limited. So even though the economy was growing rapidly, but we still had high levels of unemployment, that is, and opportunities were limited. I think we still do have high levels of unemployment, but our government perhaps less truthful and honest as they were back in those days. Now we see a lot of conflicts happening, a lot of tension happening in Jamaica. We have the JLP, or under the JLP leadership in the 1960s. They retained power. They came back to power in 1967. And at that time, they banned all type of Black power literature. So under the JLP, they were not so much friendly towards, right? The Black Power movement, and they banned books like the autobiography of Malcolm X and the works of Stokely Carmichael and Eldridge Cleaver, right? And these were books that people would be reading in the 1960s, and they would be gaining some, sort of racial pride, to imbibe, a sort of racial pride in themselves, and to say that we are African people and we have produced great people and very intelligent people, because we were looked upon as being ignorant and and people who are lacking in culture. So definitely this was a time to sort of affirm ourselves that we are as equal to any nation or race, if you will, on the planet. Now, here to further quash the Black Power movement, Jamaica also placed a ban on water robbing, and most of us know water robbing. We have heard about water robbing. A Guyanese lecturer at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, one of the main proponents of the Black Power movement at the time. In 1968, when the Jamaican government banned Rodney from re-entering the country, riots broke out. So these protests were subsequently called the Rodney riots. The ban failed to achieve the government's intent, but instead achieved quite the opposite. More Jamaicans became supportive of Black Power and rallied around the cause. So we can see whatever they were doing in the 1960s to ban the Black Power movement, even though they banned some books, right, from entering the country and from people reading them, but people were more empowered nonetheless. And what they wanted to achieve in terms of putting a dent in that movement, they achieved the opposite, because people were even more determined to project that Black identity in Jamaica. Now, this is where things started to go wrong. In the when we at the end towards the end of the 1960s, when all of our policies were pro-US, right? We were anti-communist and we were a Christian nation, as Bustamante said. But he says in 1971, the US ambassador to Jamaica, that's Vincent de Relay, sent a confidential cable to the State Department outlining his views of the PNP elected to power. Now listen to what Godfrey Smith. Godfrey Smith is an author of the latest Michael Manley biography, right? So he has written a biography on the life of Michael Manley, and he has cited this in his book. Now, this the author that is what is Ricardo Tyndale, right? The author of this thesis, he has cited a lot this work. And those of you who need to get this book, I think I would read it. And because I have read also another review of the book, it seemed to be a very, very good book. I think this Godfrey Smith is a Belizean citizen. He's from Belize. And he authored that book, and it was published, I think, in 2017. So it's a recently published book, right, on the life of Michael Manley. Now listen to what Godfrey Smith is saying, and I think he's quoting. So it had deeper ideological convictions compared to so this is what the ambassador, Relay, right, the U.S. ambassador to Jamaica, is saying about the PNP under, I think it was now under Michael Manley. It had deeper ideological convictions compared to the JLP, but no political philosophy. De Relay did not anticipate issues for the US under a PNP government. He expected more honesty in government. So this is what the US ambassador to Jamaica is saying about the PNP party. That, it doesn't have it has some deep ideological convictions, but it did not align itself with any political philosophy. Because Michael Manley would say later on that he does not believe in this, the ideology of capitalism and socialism and communism. What he was more of a practical man who thought that he would align himself with any section or any part of these ideologies that worked in the interest of the country. Right. And I think that I share that with him too. Sometimes we tend to tether ourselves to, this particular philosophy. And that's one of my, my criticisms for people writing dissertations and master's thesis and so forth and so on. Your professors tend to want you to write based on this particular ideology or philosophy. And sometimes what you're writing about really, it's not, has nothing to do, right? Has nothing to do with that particular philosophy. Or if it does have some bearing on it, but sometimes, you want to also get out of that philosophy, right? And you find yourself having to sit and write all these pages of, aligning your thesis and your findings, right, to this, you know, theoretical framework, right, which makes the dissertation almost like you know, a controlled machine, right, where you're just saying something to suit your professor, right, and not saying what really is or what reflects the reality. And I think Michael Manley was more of a pragmatic person where that is concerned. So de Relay, we say Vincent de Relay was at the time the U.S. ambassador to the United States. De Relay did not anticipate issues for the U.S. under a PNP government. He expected more honesty in government, and he characterized the tone of the PNP leaders as being more of akin to the Rooseveltian liberals than to Fabian socialists, right? So in our next presentation, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to deal with the Michael Manley's government and how that the pro-US, you know, the pro-US relations, right, that we had, that Jamaica had embraced during, we could say, after World War II onward, that it sort of was began to to dissipate, right? And we now regarded the United States. Well, I don't think we regarded the United States or the United States regarded us as one of its, hostile enemies, right? I don't think Michael Manley regarded the United States because you're going to learn that in 1978, Michael Manley did try to, to sort of improve the relationship that we have with the United States, its relations, Jamaica's relations to the United States, with the United States, but the United States, because of his rhetoric and the fact that he was seeking to nationalize industries there, and he was also supporting the war, the Cuban war, the Cuban deploying their military in the war in Angola. The United States thought that we had now aligned ourselves with its greatest enemy at the time, probably still is, in the Caribbean, that's Cuba. So these are some reflections that we need to be aware of. And we need to get out of this frame of mind that it is the British monarchy that still rules or governs Jamaica. That reality has long passed, and we should understand that. And I think that reality long passed from the times of World War II, right? And the de facto colonial master of Jamaica and the Caribbean and Latin America is really the United States of America. Now, I think some nations have more authority than some, depending on how much economic prosperity they were able to achieve. Unfortunately, our little island nation has not achieved, since its so-called independence, any financial prosperity or economic prosperity, that is. So, these are some of the thoughts I would like to share with you. I hope that you have learned something from it. And remember that we need to confront reality and not to be operating outside of reality, as most of our Jamaican people are doing at this present moment. You know, extricating ourselves from Great Britain at this time, at this juncture, will only psychologically, you know, it probably will have some positive psychological effects, but it will not solve the problems on the island. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye.